MurderMurder.news.
Hey monsters, welcome to another episode of the Murder News podcast. These weekly episodes double as weekly meetings for our very own true crime cult.
But don't worry, you've landed in the cult with all the baby goats and none of the brainwashing. We just like to imagine a secret hideaway where we can camp out with all of our spooky friends, making flower crowns, roasting marshmallows, and sharing our best scary stories about the subject that unites us all, murder.
I'm Angelina, and today I'm hanging out with my sinister sister, Aurora. How are things on your end?
Good. Right before this, I was actually petting some adorable baby goats.
Amazing. Perfect. Very in character.
Yeah, I went to this weird, Western town in Gran Canaria, and it was like a film set for a 1975 movie that I can't recall. It's nothing that I've seen. I'm not sure that it was a big film.
You're walking around in a Western town?
Yeah, so they still have it
That's
set up. It definitely has a lot of problematic elements, but they did have some baby goats and some silly shows with shootouts and a cemetery and whatever. So it was kind of fun and spooky.
That sounds like a strange amalgamation of things, like
Very
baby goats,
strange.
Cemetery, Western cowboy dudes. But what the heck?
Who knows? But somehow it works.
Sounds fun.
How about you? How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I am cat sitting a little girly named Mango this week. So I am psyched to have even more cat time. I'll take all that I can get. And I'm being paid in cookie dough. So I am just living my best life.
Win and win. Please tell me Mango is a little orange kitty.
She's not, which is funny because I do know another kitty named Mango who is orange, but this one is kind of grayish and stripy. I'm not sure why she's called Mango, but it's a cute name. She's a cute cat.
Well, we love you no matter what, Mango.
Yeah.
We like to think of you as honorary monsters just because you tune into our show week after week. But if you'd like to make things a bit more official, you can join the MMN commune on Patreon. Perks include your own flashy title like Deacon of Goats, a shout out on the show, and of course, exclusive access to our regular patron-only content.
Before we dig into today's story, let's take a look at some of the true crime headlines from this week.
18-year-old Peyton Gendron was arrested last Saturday after carrying out what authorities are calling a racially motivated attack at a supermarket in Buffalo, New York. Dressed in tactical gear and armed with a rifle, Gendron opened fire on unsuspecting shoppers at a Tops supermarket location on Jefferson Avenue, live streaming the entire event from his phone. The shooter lives outside of the area, which is predominantly a Black neighborhood, and is known to frequent websites espousing white supremacist ideologies. The man is also believed to have authored a 180-page racist conspiracy-laden manifesto titled The Great Replacement Theory. Out of 13 victims of the attack, 11 were Black. The investigation into this event is ongoing. If convicted, Peyton Gendron faces a maximum sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole.
It's becoming a common trope, live streaming murders, which is a horrific part of being in the future, I suppose.
It's just so upsetting. It's so terrifying. And I was just I had not heard about this past weekend. I was not on the news or looking at news sites very much. It was my birthday weekend, and I was just kind of tagged out. And I was speaking with some friends, some Hungarian friends last night at dinner who were asking about what it was like to travel other places they thought were dangerous. And I'm like, there's no more dangerous of a place than the US, or hardly any. It's just
not many, no.
Yeah, it's just really messed up. And so as soon as I got home last night, I was on Facebook and I read about this, and it's so upsetting. Our hearts go out to the families of anybody involved, and we've got to do something about this. It's just a nightmare.
Obviously there are countries and areas with higher crime rates in general, but with specifically dealing with gun violence, there's so many random casualties that it's just unpredictable. Like it's difficult to feel safe anywhere you go, because if you're in a grocery store, if you're in any kind of a shop, if you're just going about your errands or your day, you could come across someone armed and ready to shoot in any situation, which is just unfathomable. But ugh.
Shocking and terrifying for sure.
Yeah. Authorities in Georgetown County, South Carolina, have recovered the remains of missing 17-year-old Brittany Drexel 13 years after she went missing while on a spring break trip to Myrtle Beach. Her mother, Dawn Drexel, says Brittany was forbidden from going to Myrtle Beach, but she went anyway. The girl disappeared on her way to visit friends who were staying in another hotel. Georgetown County Sheriff Carter Weaver said in a press conference Monday that Drexel's body was found May 11th and that police have charged 62-year-old Raymond Moody with her murder, as well as obstructing justice, kidnapping, and criminal sexual conduct in the first degree.
We'll be right back after a quick commercial break.
California has the largest population in the United States and the site of some of the most famous true crime cases in history. But there's more than meets the eye to the crime in California. Join Sean, Jessica, and Charles on the California True Crime Podcast as they cover crime both infamous and overlooked from around our state, while looking at the deeper history that goes beyond beaches and movie stars.
And we're back.
Before we dig in, we want to offer a quick disclaimer. Though we joke about forming a true crime cult, that is not to diminish the severity of actual cult activity, and we want you to know that we take the cases we're discussing very seriously.
We want to deliver each story with the utmost respect to victims and anyone involved. If you feel we've missed the mark, you don't like our tone, or if you notice we've gotten any details wrong, let us know with a quick email to MurderMurder.news@gmail.com and we'll make it right. Some specific trigger warnings for this episode include abduction, torture, sexual violence, brainwashing, and being held captive. If any of the subjects are particularly sensitive for you, you may want to skip this one and listen to one of our other episodes instead.
During This Week in True Crime History, Colleen Stan was abducted on her way to surprise a friend in Northern California on their birthday. Our sources for this story include an episode of Snap Notorious and articles from FindLaw.com, Oxygen, and A&E. For a full list of sources for today's episode, be sure to check out the episode description. Colleen Stan was born Colleen Martin on New Year's Eve in 1956 in Riverside, California. Colleen was the oldest of three girls, and her parents divorced and both remarried, which threw some step-siblings into the mix. Colleen dropped out of high school at 16. She got married in Carson City, Nevada in 1973 with her parents' permission. She moved to Ohio with her new husband, Tim Stan, but their marriage basically dissolved in about a year. Colleen went back to Riverside, never officially divorcing Tim and continuing to use his last name. Colleen moved to Eugene, Oregon to live with her best friend, her friend's partner, and their baby. On May 19, 1977, 20-year-old Colleen decided to hitchhike from her home in Eugene to Northern California. Being that it was the 70s, folks weren't so dialed into the dangers of trusting strangers and traveling alone, and hitchhiking didn't seem as sketchy as it probably sounds to our listeners today. Colleen did it all the time. Actually, she thought of herself as a seasoned hitchhiker. She figured she knew how to spot a creep and was skilled in identifying a trustworthy soul.
Colleen Stan accepted a handful of rides on her way to Northern California and passed on a couple of rides. For example, she didn't think it was wise to get in a car full of dudes. Probably a good call. But when a blue van pulled up with a young couple and their baby inside, Colleen felt confident accepting a ride with them. As we mentioned in our earlier episode about the Moores murders, a tactic abductors will sometimes employ is that a couple will hunt for victims together, knowing they'll garner more trust with a woman around as opposed to just one lone creepy guy driving around. Add a baby to that equation, and things seem even more innocuous. The couple that picked up Colleen was 24-year-old Cameron Hooker and his wife, 19-year-old Janice Hooker, who lived in Red Bluff, California. They drove along for a while, just chit-chatting with nothing out of the ordinary to arouse Colleen's suspicion. But in retrospect, it sure seems like Cameron was profiling the perfect victim. He asked enough questions to find out that Colleen was separated from her husband and that she was surprising a friend. "She doesn't know you're coming?" Cameron had asked. Colleen responded, "No." Knowing no one's expecting Colleen in Northern California or back in Eugene, Hooker also knew it would probably take a while for anyone to report Colleen missing. When they stopped at a gas station and Colleen went in to use the restroom, a little voice in her head told her to jump out the window, run away, and never look back. She told herself she was being silly, got herself to snap out of it, and went back to the van. When she returned, she noticed the sudden appearance of a strange 20-pound wooden box on the seat beside her. But Colleen didn't know enough to be afraid of this box. Colleen was automatically polite, as so many of us are conditioned to be. By the time anything happened to validate her gut feeling, she was trapped with no way to escape.
Under the pretense of checking out some ice caves, the Hookers took a little detour. They pulled the van over to the side of the road in a remote area, and Colleen stayed sitting in the van while the Hooker family walked a little ways away from the vehicle. Soon after, Cameron Hooker returned and held a knife to Colleen's throat, then forced her head inside the box. This box was actually a DIY device that Cameron designed to fit snugly around a person's head and neck, blocking out the light completely, muffling the sound, and inhibiting the wearer from breathing fresh air. Cameron had been a lumber mill worker, and I guess he fancied himself a bit of a woodworker. Cameron also considered himself to be sexually and physically dominant and a bit of a BDSM enthusiast. Cameron and Janice, who went by Jan, met as teens when Jan was still in high school. Jan was the perfect submissive for Cameron's taste. Although she had no personal interest in BDSM whatsoever, she grew up in a culture that expected women to be submissive in many ways to their husbands. Jan was willing to do plenty of things she didn't find pleasurable if she could make Cameron her husband and keep him interested in her. Cameron was particularly interested in taking Jan to the woods, tying her up by her wrists, and having sex with her. These scenes escalated to tying Jan up and whipping her, and sometimes tying her up and dunking her into the water. Jan did not enjoy one bit of this, but she reasoned with herself that Cameron would only take her into the woods 2 or 3 times per month, and the rest of the time he was the nicest guy she had ever met. He was pretty good at aftercare when they did spend time in the woods, and if ever Jan set a hard boundary, which was unfortunately rare, Cameron would never cross it. She felt it was worth it to endure a bit of torture at the hands of her boyfriend if it earned her a happy relationship. Janice never stopped brainstorming other ways that she could keep Cameron happy besides the BDSM, and at one point, she made up a story that she was pregnant, hoping to trick Cameron into proposing to her, and it worked. In January of 1975, the two wed in Reno, Nevada. Janice, who was just 16 at the time, married Cameron with permission from her parents, and subsequently dropped out of high school and moved into a rented house with her new husband in Red Bluff. Janice's story eerily parallels that of their eventual victim, Colleen Stan. More unsettling is that the couple chose their home in part because of the basement, which Cameron felt was perfect for torture sessions.
The BDSM sessions further escalated, so Cameron began choking Jan until she passed out. Outside of a sexual context, Cameron also started acting out violently in anger when he and his wife would argue. He would frequently threaten to kill her in a rage. Jan found her hard limit when Cameron started strapping a gas mask to her face when they had sex. His sadistic desires were only increasing, and Jan knew she couldn't keep up with him. At this point, Cameron suggested something that the host of This Is Monsters podcast called a pain surrogate. I suppose as a label, this makes sense. If you're unable to conceive, you might get a surrogate mother. We've heard of hiring a sexual surrogate in cases of sexual dysfunction within couples. Jen couldn't handle the kind of pain her husband was so desperate to inflict, so Cameron felt bringing another woman into the relationship as his slave was the solution. Only he had a pretty fucked up way of going about it.
With Colleen Stan locked in the head box, the Hookers continued driving until taking another unsettling detour when they spotted a pretty field with wildflowers and pulled over to have a picnic. They took the box off Colleen's head then so she could watch them from the van. After the picnic, they continued to their home in Red Bluff, California. Colleen was stripped on arrival. Cameron blindfolded and gagged her inside the box, then strung her up to the basement rafters by her wrists with her feet just grazing the ground, the same way he used to string Jan up in the woods. If you're having a hard time envisioning this and for some morbid reason want some visual accompaniment to better understand this story, you can check out the horror movie The Poughkeepsie Tapes. I watched the movie in preparation for telling this story, but you can't exactly call it research. The movie is fully fictional, and though it claims to borrow its main plot line from the story of the abduction of Colleen Stan, there are a lot of holes. The box, for example, was missing from the film. You'll soon find out exactly how important the box is to this story, but let's just say for starters that this case is often referred to as the girl in the box case. The one part that the Poughkeepsie tapes just nailed was the method of stringing a victim to the basement rafters by their wrists. I think the filmmakers realized that this was their strong point because they leaned into it pretty hard, making tying up folks by their wrists the central force in the story, which in reality it was not. Either way, still pretty scary, still would recommend the movie to horror fans. It's done in a faux documentary style laced with found footage, which is an effectively terrifying treatment of a horror film if you ask me.
Despite the hookers' unconventional method for procuring a slave, they felt it was important to lay down some ground rules. For instance, Jan forbade Cameron from having sex with Colleen. Jan was down to have a pain surrogate around, but not a sexual surrogate. Jan specifically wanted all the actual sex for herself because now that Cameron wasn't getting violent with her anymore, she wanted more babies. Hanging from the rafters in the hooker's basement, Colleen could see, peering out from under her blindfold, a page from a magazine taped to the wall of the basement with a picture of a woman tied up the same way. Cameron would whip her each time she tried to reach her toes out and find something to rest her feet on, hoping to ease the tension of the rope against her wrists. After he grew tired of whipping her, Cameron gave Colleen a box to rest her feet on. Colleen could see, peering out from under her blindfold, the hookers having sex on the floor nearby. When they finished, Cameron took Colleen down from where she was hanging, chained her wrists together, and placed her inside of a crate in the basement, tying her feet to the crate. Locked inside of the head box, Colleen lived with a constant sensation of something clasped firmly around her neck, slowly strangling her. This is how Colleen slept during her first night in captivity.
Aside from the head box and the crate, Cameron had also built a homemade contraption he called the rack, as well as a triangular-shaped box that fit under the stairs and a coffin-shaped box that fit under the waterbed where he and Jan slept. The first morning, when she awoke in the hooker's basement, Cameron took Colleen out of the crate and strapped her to the rack, leaving her suspended there for hours on end with the head box still firmly in place. Later that day, the hookers brought her a bedpan and the first meal she was provided since she arrived, a bowl of cheesy potatoes and a glass of water. That evening, Cameron strung his victim from the rafters for another torture session before he locked her to the crate, still wearing the head box, for another night in the damp, dark basement. The following day, Cameron figured he'd treat his new slave to a couple of egg salad sandwiches. When Colleen wasn't hungry enough to eat more than half a sandwich, he punished her by hanging her from the rafters by her wrists and whipping her until she passed out. When she regained consciousness, she was strapped to the rack and instructed to finish the sandwiches. This was pretty much the routine for the next several days. Colleen would spend her nights locked to the crate, her days strapped to the rack, all with the head box on, with the only exception being when she was served one single meal per day and allowed to use the bedpan. A couple of times a week, he would hang her from the rafters by the wrists, take photos, and carry out torture sessions.
Colleen Stan was finally reported missing on April 25th, 1977 by her roommate, Alice. Alice was concerned because she hadn't heard from her friend at all. She couldn't call Colleen's friend, whose birthday had just passed, because that friend, Linda, didn't have a phone. She called Colleen's mom in Riverside, who said she hadn't seen or heard from Colleen either, and then Alice decided to go to the police. The police, unsurprisingly, didn't take her report very seriously. With no one really looking for Colleen and with the hookers keeping up appearances, Colleen's confinement went on and on. For 5 months, Colleen was kept naked, bound and gagged, and locked inside the head box in the basement. One day, Cameron realized that if he continued to leave Colleen in the basement around the clock, someone might somehow see her through the window or hear her screams if she were to scream while the hookers weren't at home. That was when Cameron moved Colleen to the coffin-sized box, locked her inside, and placed the box underneath the bed where he and Jan slept each night. Colleen may have been relieved to be free from her head box and out of the cold, damp basement if she weren't faced with the fresh hell of living locked inside a hot box 24/7 all summer long in California. Cameron's innovation to keep his victim a bit cooler inside the box was to drill holes on either end of the box and to position a hairdryer on the cool setting, blowing into one of the holes.
Even as a hairstylist who regularly hears the sound of a hairdryer for the better part of most days, this sounds like a form of torture on its own.
It really does. Also, I feel like hairdryers like now kind of put out cool air, but I feel like
it wouldn't have been that
when
cool.
I started using
Couldn't
them in
you
the
just
80s,
use a
they
fan?
didn't.
I don't
Right.
really understand. But yeah,
Terrible.
Scary solution. Cameron continued to take Colleen out of the box only during her one meal per day, to use the bedpan, and for regular torture sessions. The torture that he would subject Colleen to continued to escalate to strangulation and eventually even drowning. He got a kick out of bringing her to the brink of death and watching her cling to life in a panic. It sounds like he got into a steady routine here and successfully managed to fit owning a sex slave into his life, but Cameron hadn't thought of everything. In fact, some very basic things stopped him up. Since no one was brushing Colleen's hair, it began to form some pretty serious mats that couldn't be brushed out. Cameron and Janice had to cut Colleen's waist-length hair nearly up to her chin. Cameron took all the frustration he had over this event out on Colleen. He hogtied her and placed her face down in the bath. He would just watch as she thrashed around, trying not to drown, and wait until what he thought was the very last second, and then pull her up by the hair to bring her head above the water so she could gasp for air. He repeated this again and again for 2 hours before locking her back in the box for the night. Cameron also hadn't factored in what to do when his slave had her period. Colleen had missed several periods due to stress and malnourishment, and she actually didn't have a single period for the first several months that she was held captive by the hookers. Eventually, she did have a period, and it seemed to enrage Cameron. He was also enraged and would punish Colleen when she couldn't wait until he brought the bedpan around and soiled herself inside of the box.
Colleen was held captive for nearly a year before her captor presented her with a contract. Having recently had some guests over, Cameron told Colleen that they had been associates of him from an organization called The Company, and they weren't pleased that he had an unregistered slave. He explained that the company is an immense multinational sex trafficking organization. They kept a slave registry, and he had to get Colleen to sign a contract for her file. The contract had been drawn up and was taken straight from the pages of a novel called The Story of O. The book had been published under the pen name of Pauline Rayage, and due to the graphic nature of the novel and all the controversy that surrounded it, the author did not admit that it was her work until sometime in the 90s, 40 years after it was published. While its author was still anonymous, many refused to believe that it could have been a woman, with several speculations about male authors that could have written it. The book tells the story of a Parisian fashion photographer known only as O, who was sexually enslaved by her lover with her permission. As part of O's agreement with her master, she is taught to make herself sexually available to any of the members of the secret society that her master belongs to. Cameron Hooker, obviously a fan, modeled his contract after the one in the book, but took out the last bit about being sexually available to anyone in the organization. In the contract, he used a pseudonym, even though his real name was clear because Colleen had heard Jan say it many times. Jan signed as a witness, also with a pseudonym. When Colleen asked, "What happens if I don't sign it?" Cameron responded, "Then I'll sign it for you and you'll wish you had."
Cameron told his victims stories about slaves who had tried to escape, talking like he had had several slaves in the past, and like everyone he knew at the company had slaves, so he had plenty of stories. He said that when a slave would try to run away, they were always caught and often tortured to death. He spoke of one slave who allegedly ran away and went straight to the police station, only to meet a police officer who was a member of the company. She was returned to her master, and as punishment for her offense, her arms and legs were amputated. At this point, Colleen conveniently noticed a bandage on Jan's knee and asked about it. Cameron used it to underline his story. He said Jan had been a slave of his and that when she tried to run away, she was caught by some members of the company, beaten within an inch of her life, and her knee was broken to teach her a lesson not to run away again. The hookers told Colleen that at that point, Jan was no longer a slave, but had risen to become a member of the company herself. In reality, Jan just had a bad knee, and she had recently had a scheduled knee surgery. Cameron told Colleen that several of their neighbors were in the company and that many police officers, taxi drivers, proprietors of local businesses, congressmen, etc. were all members too. Colleen bought it. You have to remember that Colleen has been in captivity for nearly a year at this point, malnourished, sleep-deprived, deprived of sunlight, and of course, routinely tortured. Who knows what she believed of her captors up until this point, but at that point in time that she was served the contract, in the condition she was in, Cameron's story made sense, and Colleen signed the contract. From that point forward, Colleen was told she was only to be referred to as K, just the letter K. This was inspired by the story of O, critics of which have stated that as part of the ultimate objectification of a woman, the character has the shortest possible name. Colleen was to address Cameron as master or sir, and she would call Janice ma'am.
With the security of the contract behind him, Cameron felt more comfortable giving Colleen a little more freedom. She was then allowed to take supervised bathroom breaks and more frequent showers. The hookers also put her to work making macrame pieces that they would sell at flea markets and farmers markets to bring in some extra money. One particularly hot summer day, Colleen worked herself into a bit of a fit locked inside her box, and she thrust her legs out as hard as she could over and over until, to her surprise, she smashed the end right off the box and was able to climb out. At first, she didn't move at all. Then she reluctantly climbed out, dismayed by what she had done. When Cameron got home from work, she told him what she had done and was shocked to find he wasn't even angry. This was likely because he took this as a sign that Colleen was under his thumb. She managed to escape her box, but she chose to stay. She was so brainwashed and so controlled by him that she even apologized to him for smashing the box. Cameron reinforced the box and presented the new and improved box for Kay to sleep in and said she would still be locked inside the box at night, but she could spend some time around the house during the day under the conditions that she would do all of the cleaning and any chores that the hookers assigned to her. Jan was enjoying the extra help around the house, but began to suspect that her husband was developing feelings for his slave. As you might recall, Cameron had promised Jan that he would never have sex with Colleen, and that was part of the deal from the beginning. Jan decided to test her husband by suggesting to him that they have a threesome with Kay just to see what he would say. He was actually into the idea, and though Jan was repulsed, she tried to go along with it for a little while. But as soon as Cameron began to have sex with Colleen, Jan felt nauseated, ran to the bathroom, and threw up. After that encounter, Colleen could feel that Jan was generally meaner to her, like she was jealous. She would bark orders about household chores and constantly snapped at Colleen. The Hooker family soon expanded, with Jan giving birth to a baby daughter on their waterbed, with Colleen locked in the box underneath.
At some point, the Hookers moved to a new house, and the new place didn't come with the feature of the ideal torture basement. Cameron decided he was going to build a shed out back and dig out a dungeon underneath it, and that was where the torture would go on. He got Colleen to help him build the shed, and when it came to digging the dungeon, they worked by night, which went unnoticed by the neighbors. In the new dungeon, Cameron constructed a giant X that he would strap Colleen to, and he would shock her with electricity and burn her pubic area with a heat gun. He decided to hell with the agreement he made with Jan and started routinely raping Colleen. Colleen would regularly be seen doing yard work and hanging out with the Hookers and their two small daughters. The Hookers told the neighbors and their own kids that Kay was their nanny. When they talked about the nanny with their friends and neighbors, they referred to her as Kay Powers, and everyone, including the children, believed that Kay went home to her own apartment each night. No one noticed anything out of the ordinary, and Colleen's belief in the company kept her compliant. Once, Cameron Hooker said something to Colleen about the company holding a conference in Sacramento. The following day, while Colleen was outside, she overheard a neighbor vaguely mention a trip to Sacramento, and Colleen took it as confirmation that he was part of the company.
Over time, Jan's bitterness towards Kay began to fade away as she realized that Kay was her only friend. They started hanging out like girlfriends and even going out together some nights, drinking and dancing. When Jan didn't want to do overtime for the electronics company where she worked, she convinced them to hire Kay for piecework. In 1980, the hookers took a trip to Chico, California. Their nanny, Kay Powers, went along with them. While on vacation, Colleen was permitted to call her family from a payphone at a gas station with Cameron's supervision. She spoke only to her sister Bonnie, who seemed happy to hear from Colleen and didn't seem to suspect anything was wrong. Of course, Bonnie did suspect something was wrong after not hearing from her sister for years, but she didn't know what. Also, in 1980, Cameron Hooker put Colleen's loyalty to the test. He handed her a gun and told her to put it in her mouth. After she did that, he told her to pull the trigger. Colleen didn't have any idea whether or not the gun was loaded, but she didn't see any option other than following her master's instructions. She pulled the trigger. The gun wasn't loaded, Colleen survived, and Cameron was appeased. What followed is what Colleen would refer to as her year out. She appeared free to come and go as she pleased, going jogging every day and then hanging out with her friends from work. Her friendship with Jan continued, and the two started going to church together every Sunday.
In 1981, Cameron told Colleen that he had a meeting at the company's headquarters, which was near her hometown. He said he had requested permission for Colleen to visit her family and that the company had approved his request. Colleen was instructed to say goodbye to all the neighbors and friends at work before the trip, telling them she was going home for the summer. After driving by a large office building that Cameron pointed out as the company's headquarters and telling Colleen that she was lucky the company waived their usual requirement of a lie detector test before her family visit, Cameron dropped Colleen off. She spent some time with her parents, sisters, and an aunt. Everyone thought Colleen was in a cult, and they didn't want to push her away now that she was finally calling and visiting after so much time away, so they tread lightly, making an effort not to pry. When Cameron came back around, the visit was cut short, but Colleen's parents insisted on snapping a quick photo of the happy couple before they left. Cameron introduced himself as Colleen's fiancé.
As you probably predicted, when Cameron made Colleen say goodbye to her neighbors, he was about to lock her up for a while. He wasn't a fan of Colleen's friendship with his wife. It was Cameron's turn to be jealous. He and Jan had a fight about him having sex with Colleen, though Cameron had been doing it in secret. Colleen had confided in Jan. Cameron pointed to a series of Bible verses that he felt justified him having sex with Colleen. Jan wasn't sure what to think. Colleen spent some extra time in the box as punishment. In 1984, Jan and Colleen met with a priest at their church, presenting their situation as more of a love triangle scenario and asking if the Bible verses Cameron was always quoting actually excused it. The priest told the women that they were living in sin and that they needed to end it. Jan genuinely liked Colleen and felt terrible for deceiving her. After going to the priest, Colleen had reminded Jan that they couldn't leave because the company would find them. Jan wasn't immediately ready to admit that the company was made up, so she started off by telling Colleen that Cameron wasn't really part of the company and he had lied about being a member. Later, Cameron expressed interest in procuring another slave. Jan was furious and wanted no part of it. She went back to visit the priest alone, confessing that Cameron had abducted Colleen and that he had tortured them both, and the priest advised that she and Colleen leave immediately. Jan explained that it wasn't as easy as that. Their kids were in daycare, and before long, Cameron would have to come home from work. The priest advised Jan to spend one more night with him, and she and Colleen should run away after he left for work the next morning. Jan called Colleen at work at a local motel where she was a maid. She broke down and confessed that the company wasn't real and that Cameron had made up the whole thing. Colleen went to her boss, resigned, and her boss asked if she would just work the rest of her shift before she left, and Colleen agreed.
That has to be the most incredibly weird and confusing moment of the whole thing. Colleen suddenly found out that everything she knows to be real is a lie, and then she just works out the rest of her shift. Like, what's on her mind the rest of that time? That's very
it's
intense.
So hard, but she's just so terrified of him and so beaten down. It's like all she knows at this point, and like she probably feels some kind of messed up, loved in like this way too. Like
that's how the brainwashing works. Yeah,
so
it does effectively make you feel that way. The next morning, Jan picked up the kids and called her parents to let them know they would be coming to visit for a while. Colleen called her dad and said very little other than that she wanted to come home and that she would need some money. He wired her a few $100 and she bought a ticket for the next bus to Riverside. Before she boarded the bus, Colleen called Cameron to tell him straight up that she was leaving and that she knew he was a fraud. She was again shocked to find that Cameron wasn't mad. Cameron called Jan at her parents' place and pleaded with her to come back, insisting he would change. Jan had given her parents very few details about why she had called it off with Cameron, and they advised her to go back and give it another shot. Jan got in touch with Colleen and asked her if she could please not go to the police with this. She said that she believed Cameron truly wanted to make a change and that they owed him at least a chance to prove himself. Colleen agreed not to contact the police and said next to nothing about her ordeal to her family. Janice and the kids moved back in with Cameron.
A few months went by, and Jan could feel something was off about Cameron, and she began to question whether he was truly capable of change. One night, when the two were in bed together in the middle of the night, Jan could feel Cameron's energy. She could tell he was laying there awake, and she could feel a palpable rage. She asked him if he was awake, and Cameron said yes. She asked what was bothering him, and he said he didn't know. In the moment, she tried to think of something to deflect her husband's rage away from herself and maybe even diffuse it a little. She suggested they go outside and burn all of his porn, his contraptions, photos he took of Colleen, etc., in case Cameron was worried about getting in trouble. Cameron was into the idea. It may have saved her that night, but the two destroyed a heck of a lot of evidence in the process. Around this time, Jan also confided in a coworker and a friend at the church about her husband abducting a girl and holding her captive for 7 years. Her friends asked Jan why she didn't do anything to stop it, and Jan said she tried and that ultimately she did help the girl escape. What finally sunk in for Jan to make her realize that Cameron would never change and that they needed to escape when her friend pointed out that if she didn't leave immediately and report her husband to the police, he might eventually do something like this to their daughters.
Janice was finally ready to leave Cameron and to go to the police about his crimes. She started to tell the police about Colleen's abduction, torture, and confinement, but they were like, hey, wait a minute, you helped? And Jan clammed up. But not before mentioning that Colleen wasn't the first girl her husband had abducted. Last time, it was a girl called Marie Elizabeth Spanacki, which Jan knew because she read it on the girl's driver's license. Spanacki had vanished in January of 1976 after a fight with her boyfriend. Investigators initially suspected the boyfriend, but he was soon cleared and the case went cold. According to Jan, they had picked her up hitchhiking and Cameron strung her to the rafters in the basement just to see it done to Colleen. Only with his first victim, he cut out her vocal cords so she couldn't scream. Cameron shot the girl in the stomach with a pellet gun and strangled her, murdering her. The hookers allegedly rolled her body up in a carpet, drove into the mountains, and buried it alongside a dirt road. Investigators quickly realized that they would have little evidence or testimony in either case if they didn't have Jan on their side, so they applied for full immunity for Jan, which was granted in exchange for her full testimony. Jan tried to lead them to Spanacki's body, but she couldn't remember where they had buried it. She remembered that Cameron had kept the girl's watch as a trophy, but had lost it at work. His coworker remembered Cameron wearing a woman's watch for a while, but it fell into the conveyor belt one day and was never recovered. They would unfortunately not get justice for Marie Elizabeth Spanacki, but the idea that Cameron could be a murderer or even a budding serial killer motivated police to get him on the Colleen Stan case.
Prosecutors would need testimony from both Janice and Colleen, and both willingly gave it. For the most part, their accounts of events matched up. Still, the trial was incredibly hard on Colleen, the defense team and the media both skeptical of her victimhood. What about the smiling photo her parents took, or the fact that she signed the contract? And what about all the time she held a job at the motel, went jogging each morning, and chit-chatted with the neighbors? It sure seemed like she was there out of her own free will, free to leave if she wanted to. Colleen had kept in touch with Cameron in the months since her escape, which seemed a little questionable to some who couldn't understand the lasting effects of her trauma, the concept of trauma bonding, and Stockholm Syndrome. The police who took Colleen's initial statement noted how curious it was that she seemed so cold and unemotional, delivering the story smoothly and evenly and without crying. On the stand, everyone was shocked to hear Colleen's flat, emotionless description of the events. Cameron seemed pretty helpless after Colleen left him, even once asking her to instruct him on how to make a tuna sandwich. On a few occasions, Colleen had said or written to Cameron Hooker that she loved him. The defense thought that proved something, but eventually they let it go as their client condemned himself.
Cameron readily admitted that he had abducted Colleen Stan, but he had assumed this was something he couldn't get in trouble for, pointing out that the statute of limitations for prosecuting an abduction is 7 years. Since he kept Colleen in captivity for 7 years, he thought he was in the clear, until he was informed that the clock starts after the captive is released, not the moment they're abducted.
Love that.
Yeah. At the time of the trial, Colleen had been free for just 1 year, well within the statute of limitations. Hooker argued that he should be able to present evidence from Colleen's sexual life before her abduction to prove that she was promiscuous, that she liked it rough, and that it wouldn't have been out of character for her to have willingly signed the slave contract. Thankfully, the court ruled this evidence inadmissible. Cameron Hooker really thought he had covered all the bases by making Colleen sign the contract, and he held nothing back, thinking there was no way he could be convicted of any crime. He insisted that Colleen had consented to all of the sexual acts he was charged with.
Over 100 pieces of physical evidence were introduced by the prosecution, including the Hooker's waterbed and the box concealed underneath, a copy of the slavery contract, photos of Colleen in bondage, the head box, and a stretcher that Cameron would strap Colleen to in the dungeon. A psychologist testified that Hooker's methods were classic ways of gaining coercive control over a victim. Everything from stripping her naked, controlling her food intake, and what she was able to use in the washroom and depriving her of daylight, to requiring Colleen to ask permission to do anything and threatening her if she did not comply. It was all designed to eliminate resistance and make Colleen pliable. The psychologist stated that it would naturally take quite some time for a person in Colleen's condition to return to normal life and to muster the strength to confront and accuse her captor. A medical examination concluded that Colleen had a number of lasting injuries and scars that were consistent with her alleged treatment at the hands of Cameron Hooker. She had electrical burns on her thighs, her hair was thinning from malnutrition, and had thick calluses from forcing her body into the box, and was 1 inch taller than she had been before her abduction because the stretcher she was often strapped to. The stretcher also left Colleen with a permanent shoulder injury. She had a scar on her labia where Hooker had pierced it and placed an identification tag on the ring. This labia tag was another concept ripped directly from the pages of The Story of O.
The jury found Cameron Hooker guilty of kidnapping with the use of a deadly weapon, forcible oral copulation, penetration with a foreign object, forcible sodomy, and 6 counts of rape. A 7th count of rape resulted in a hung jury and was ultimately dismissed. Hooker was sentenced to consecutive prison terms totaling 104 years, ineligible for parole until 2023. California's elderly parole program moved his hearing up 7 years to 2015. But at that time, his request for parole was denied, and it was announced that he would be eligible for another hearing in 2030. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, Governor Gavin Newsom decided it was in the state of California's best interest to reduce the population in state prisons, effectively reducing the spread of the virus among inmates. As a result, Hooker became eligible for early parole in March 2021. Also due to the ongoing pandemic, it seems like Cameron Hooker's hearing date has been repeatedly moved, and we're not sure where he stands today. Authorities are hoping to soon determine whether Hooker should be classified as a sexually violent predator, which would result in him being committed to a state hospital rather than released on parole. Colleen continues to work to prevent Cameron Hooker's parole. You can find petitions floating around online to block his release. according to the New York Daily News, Colleen Stan, quote, tried to move on to a normal life, but misery followed her. A string of failed marriages and a troubled child who is now in jail, end quote. Colleen got her accounting degree and then joined and began volunteering for Reading Women's Refuge Center, an organization to help abused women. She has since changed her last name. Janice reverted to her maiden name and is now known as Jan Lashley. She became a registered social worker and mental health professional. Janice and Colleen are no longer friends, and Colleen is no longer in contact with Jan or her children or Cameron Hooker.
Wow, it's so terrifying to imagine him being released. Like how scary that must be for Colleen. Just terrible.
Yeah, I mean, his crimes are about the worst thing that I can imagine. Like,
Horrendous.
There's a number of ways which you can be hurt or murdered, but being in captivity for 7 years and routinely tortured the entire time is just, and not knowing which way is up or what is real in the world is just like the most
living
disturbing
in a
thing.
Box, like it's just, gosh, like it's just horrific. This has got to be one of the worst cases of torture I've ever read about, and like how long it went on for. Like it's just terrifying.
Yeah, it's one criminal that I hope is never, ever, ever released to see the light of day.
Stay somewhere.
Yeah.
Not on the streets.
Please put him
for sure.
somewhere.
Somewhere.
Yeah. Somewhere else.
Yeah.
So what have you been watching this week?
I was deep into birthday celebration most of the weekend, and I didn't have a chance to watch much.
You've been watching The Real World for once.
Yes, for sure. And the only thing I started to watch today is The Staircase on HBO with Toni Collette. And is it Colin Firth, the one that was Mr. Darcy? Is he the right Colin?
I think so.
Yeah.
How is it?
I'm partway into the first episode, and I'm not quite sure what stance they're taking on his guilt, or if they're kind of leaving it vague and letting us decide. So I'm not really quite sure what to think. Right now, they're kind of suggesting that the belief of the show could be, and I'm only like halfway through the first episode, that he was targeted because he was like trying to call out political people in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I've never heard this theory before, and I don't know anything about it. So I'm not sure if that's the entire direction the show is going to take, or if they're exploring a lot of options. But I'm like, I'm not so sure about this. That is
curious.
Yeah.
But with Toni Collette, it has to be well acted.
Yeah, it's very well acted. And I have to say that Colin is killing it. It's not so much, obviously, Toni Collette plays the Kathleen Peterson who was murdered. So her role isn't as big. But his mannerisms, he's British. And sometimes I'm very bothered by British people's American accents. Not bothered, but it's like, okay, I can tell.
Nice try.
You didn't quite nail it, but he does a great job with the mannerisms. And like at times you think you're like seeing Michael at his trial. Like we haven't gotten to the trial yet, but like you like feel like you've seen this guy before. Like he's almost like too good. It's creepy. Like he's killing it.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Isn't Toni Collette is like Australian or something also? So she's doing an accent too?
Yeah. And she's been in American films for so long. I never noticed I'm saying like all British and Australians are
more
like whatever,
British.
But that's not true. Like just it's every once in a while. Like even Nicole Kidman, I can like detect it sometimes. It's like too
once in a while.
Yes,
it's weird when Nicole Kidman tries to do an accent that's not American, but like when she was doing like the Russian accent and stuff, and you're like, this sounds like a weird twisted version.
I did not care for her Russian accent, but I still love her.
Yeah. Oh, she's great. Accents are hard. I can't do them
for sure. And how about you? What are you watching?
As far as true crime stuff, I started watching the documentary Our Father, which our friend pointed out on our group.
I've heard about this.
Yeah, this is the story of a fertility doctor running a fertility clinic who was secretly just implanting his own sperm into 100% of his clients.
Yes.
It's really disgusting for a lot of reasons.
Right.
One of them being, of course, that sperm donors are limited to 3 children in a certain geographical area, because we don't want kids to not know that they're related and grow up and say a brother and sister get married unknowingly. And with with, dozens of babies around this little area. This doctor has created quite an issue. Yeah. And also creepy is that it wasn't just the women who went in seeking a sperm donor. Like, it was also couples who went in together who weren't infertile but were having trouble conceiving, and they were supposed to implant IVF, the husband's sperm in the wife, and instead he still put his sperm in that situation. It just really disgustingly horrible, and apparently not the only time this has happened. You can look up and find other cases, which is just revolting. So that's a good one. Definitely recommend if you want to be creeped out. Watch that sounds film.
So creepy. I remember there being a similar episode of Law and Order SVU years ago with John Stamos. That was kind of a similar concept.
John Stamos was the creepy doctor?
Yeah, he was the creepy doctor.
Amazing.
I'm 90% sure he was definitely like getting women pregnant against their permission. I'm pretty sure that was, it's been a long time since I've seen the episode, but I'm pretty sure that was the premise. And I'm not sure if it's based on this guy or like someone similar. I don't know how often this happens.
Yeah.
We should Google that. Someone Google that for us.
Someone told me there is like I think a French or a Quebecois film with a similar premise, but it was like a fictional movie called Starbuck. I haven't seen that, but apparently that's the point of that film. And there was a American remake, which I forgot what it's called, but I want to look that up too. This is a really fascinating and disturbing subject for sure.
Amazing.
And I also watched a really disturbing body horror film called Titan, which is also French. And it was about basically a girl who got pregnant after having sex with a car. So like very bizarre, very, very bizarre. But yeah, body horror is a lot to take at any time. So there's definitely some real squirmy moments. And it touches on some sort of criminal themes. There's themes of like missing persons and of course like harassment and assault and things like this. So it's like interesting, probably appealing to any true crime fan as well if you can stomach body horror.
Right.
Well, I guess that's enough murder for 1 week. If I've misjudged your capacity for creepy murder stories, you can find plenty of others on MurderMurder.news, where we post the latest in true crime news every day of the week.
You can also find us on Instagram at MurderMurder.news, on Twitter at Murder News, on TikTok at MurderMurder.news, and on Facebook you can find our page by searching for MurderMurder.news.
And while you're on Facebook searching for MurderMurder.news, you'll also see our little group pop up. You'll want to make sure you're a member if you enjoy things like live virtual events and meeting new spooky friends for book club. We're currently reading The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman, and we'll meet to discuss the book on Zoom on Sunday, May 28th, which means you still have a week or so to get reading.
Make your random act of kindness this week by leaving us a 5-star review. Reviews help new fans find the show and let us know what you like so we can keep delivering all the best in true crime content.
Have a great week.
Bye, friends.